You guys voted to watch turning plastic gloves into hot sauce. To be honest, I'm curious about the process too.
I turned plastic gloves into grape soda, and now I want to try turning them into hot sauce. This is something I've been wanting to do almost since this channel started, and in theory, it should be possible. This is because plastic gloves, specifically vinyl ones, can sometimes contain a chemical called DINP. It's used to make the gloves more durable, softer, and malleable, but I don't really care about any of that. All I care about is that it looks vaguely similar to this, which is a naturally occurring chemical that gives chili peppers their spiciness.
Oh no, evil companies don't look. I want my hot sauce to be authentic. I don't want to eat
These long
plastic.
tails in particular are almost exactly the same, and they were what I was most interested in. This was because I felt that it was possible to pluck them off the DINP and to then use them as a starting point to build the spicy molecule. Based on this, in my opinion, the general idea that it came up with was relatively simple. I first had to find some gloves that contained DINP. I could then extract it and turn it into pure spiciness. And then I could use that to make some hot sauce. The only issue was that this would be by far the biggest project I'd ever attempted. I also wasn't exactly sure how to do it, or if it would actually work, and there was a decent chance that it would be a total failure.
But this video of his came out, so it's gotta work.
But anyway, to get started, we first have to go back to when I turned plastic gloves into grape soda. This is because this hot sauce project actually kind of started at the exact same time. So now, this was almost 2 years ago, and I was about to start making my grape soda. I had a nice box of plastic gloves,
it's also
and
grape
I started
soda?
by pulling out about 20 of them. For this project, the gloves that I used were also vinyl, and I chopped them into smaller pieces.
It's such a waste. You can use the gloves to garden or something.
When I was done, I put it on a hot plate, and I added just enough rubbing alcohol to cover them.
Just enough. Just eyeball it.
On top of this, I put a bowl filled with cold water, and I turned on the hot plate. After that, I waited for the alcohol to start boiling, and I was doing this to extract something called a phthalate. And the reason that I wanted the phthalate was because it was very close to the main chemical that gives grape Kool-Aid its flavor. There were many types of phthalates, though, and I really didn't care which one I had because it really didn't matter. It could have been any of the several that were commonly used in vinyl gloves, like DEHP, DBP, or DNOP. Just by complete chance, though, these were the only gloves.
I might be blocking a lot of words, so I will be switching to this type. Yeah, new background, yippee.
That I could find, and they contained diisononyl phthalate, or DINP for short. After about an hour, it was ready, and all of the DINP should have dissolved into the alcohol. What I had to do next was get rid of all the leftover plastic, so I poured it into a funnel that was plugged with some cotton.
Cotton? Just to filter it out.
When this was done, I was left with a solution of DINP,
This has gotta
and I
be
concentrated
poisonous.
it by evaporating off half the alcohol. This ended up taking about an hour, but what I was left with was still a bit cloudy, so I had to filter it again. I did the exact same thing where I just poured it through some cotton, and when it was eventually done, it was looking a lot cleaner. What I had now was a nice and clear solution of DINP, and what I did next was add a concentrated solution of sodium hydroxide drain cleaner.
NaOH.
This started reacting almost immediately with the DINP, and it was slicing off its tails. Now on their own, the tails were becoming something called isononanol, and the rest of the molecule was turning into sodium phthalate.
This is giving me a flashback of my chemistry classes. Oh no!
To fully complete the reaction, though, I had to boil it for a while, and when it was done, I poured it all into a separatory funnel.
We didn't really do much of experiments. We just hit the books. Experiments are for 1 or 2 times.
Into 2 layers, and for the grape project, I wanted the bottom one because it contained all of the sodium phthalate. So I drained it all out into a beaker, and I continued on with that mission. Left behind, though, was a bunch of yellow liquid, which was mostly rubbing alcohol. However,
so you
it
can
also
use it?
contained all of the isononanol tails, and this was
Isolona-
where my hot
no,
sauce adventure
no,
began.
no.
Or, I mean, where it technically began,
It looked like
because I
pee.
didn't actually end up touching any of this for over a year. This is mostly because it took me that long to get the courage to attempt this project. One day, though,
Okay.
I randomly decided that I was ready to commit to it, and I just got started. The first thing that I had to do was find all of that yellow juice that I'd made, which was actually 5 jars.
It seriously looks like cooking oil. Beware of someone accidentally using it.
And not just one. This was because I ended up needing a lot more sodium phthalate for the grape flavor, and I had to repeat the same extraction 4 more times on a total of 100 gloves.
Oh, great.
But either
So I guess the bad companies won't be doing this because the cost is so much higher. You need so much more ingredients to make the final hot sauce product rather than just taking chili peppers and chili.
way, all this meant was that I now had a bunch more of it, and what I had to do next was pull out all of the isononanol that was in here. Then, once I had it isolated, I could start building it into my spicy molecule called nor-dihydrocapsaicin.
Oh, jeez.
But with that being
I am
said,
not
to get the
remembering that.
isononanol, it was relatively simple, and I was just going to have to distill it. So, to get started, I poured everything into a large flask.
Yippee, cooking oil. It looks like the orange on my
After
head.
that, I dropped in a stir bar, and above the flask, I added a short path condenser and a thermometer.
Being a chemist
I
is
then
such
attached some water lines to
an
cool the condenser,
expensive job.
and I also added a heating mantle. The beaker was there to collect everything that distilled over, and when I felt that I was ready, I turned on the heating. It wasn't too long before hot vapor started climbing out of the flask, and it eventually made it to the condenser. This was turning it from a vapor back into a liquid.
I always wanted to make seawater into distilled water, but I never had the right apparatus because it's chemistry class to make a lot of distilled water. I know you can use a pan lid to let the water blow out, but I'm scared that it might slide off and break. It's a glass lid, so that experiment never happened.
And it started dripping into the beaker. What I was collecting here was the isopropyl rubbing alcohol that I had originally used to extract the DINP. The goal here was to distill over all of it, and left behind should have been just the isononanol. So, I was just going to have to wait for it all to make it over, and unfortunately, it was going to take a while.
Is he using a Bunsen burner? I don't think he is, right?
It ended up taking even longer than I expected, and it took 4 hours to collect about 800
4
mils.
hours?
I then swapped it out for a new beaker, and I continued waiting.
Damn! This
It was
is a
only
long
after
process.
another 2 hours that it was finally looking like it was close to being done. However, I then saw something that I didn't like. The
What?
liquid that was coming over had become cloudy,
Like us.
and this meant that there was water in it. And this was a
Oh.
problem because there was still
Nope.
way too much liquid in the flask.
Look at that, all the water.
This told me that most of it was just water, and I had to stop the distillation. I then had to wait for it to cool down, and when it was only slightly warm, I poured it all into a separatory funnel.
I need to filter it out again.
The stuff that I had now looked a lot thicker and goopier than before, and by the time I was done adding it, I could already see some water separating out. I then let it sit there for about half an hour, and I waited for it to fully separate.
That's
When
kind
it
of
eventually
cool.
looked like it was done, I opened the valve, and I drained it all out.
Your hands need to be very fast. Oh. Hip, a little bit. Up. Ah.
Left in the funnel should have been mostly isononanol, and I poured all of it back into a flask. It was all still really dirty and orange, though, and I was gonna have to clean it up. To do this, I'd have to do another distillation, and I put together almost the exact same setup as before. I then waited, and over the next 15 minutes, it eventually started boiling. Then not too long after this, something started coming over, and it was just water. The temperature then slowly started
no
rising,
water.
and I started collecting some other weird oily junk.
What
Eventually,
is that?
though, the temperature stopped rising when it got to 205°C, and this was the boiling point of isononanol. The fact that it stopped here was a nice confirmation that I did in fact have isononanol, and I swapped out the beaker. What was coming over now looked really nice and clean, and I kept collecting it until it got to 208°C.
Yeah, before this we were using Bunsen burners.
At this point,
the
the
cool
distillation
blue
was done,
flames.
and I now had a bunch of fresh isononanol.
Now they
In
aren't
total,
even
it was
using
about
it
97
anymore.
grams, and it was almost exactly how much I was hoping to get. It was also way more than I needed, which was nice, because it meant that I could screw up a lot and still be okay.
Okay.
But anyway, with that being said, I could finally start trying to build my spicy molecule, and the first step was to convert this isononanol into isononanoic acid. I wasn't exactly sure how to do this, but the first idea that I came up with was to use something called potassium permanganate. This was because I had already used it a few
Permanganate.
years ago to do a very similar
Ooh.
reaction. I turned butanol into butanoic acid, which smells like vomit, and I figured I could just
Vomit.
almost do the same thing. However, long story short, it didn't work at all.
It's
I
so
tried many
pretty.
times, but it was always a complete and utter failure. So I was going to have to come up with another way, and I started thinking that something called Jones reagent.
The only thing that I like in chemistry class is like the colors of it. But we don't really do much experiments, so it's always the theory and it makes my brain hurt.
Might work. It was also pretty much the only other option that I had, and I decided to try
Please
it
save
out.
me.
To get started, the first step was to make the Jones reagent, and I added 22 mils of water to a beaker. I then added 15.4 grams of chromium trioxide, and I stirred it until it all dissolved.
I wonder how much all this cost.
When it was all gone, I moved it to an ice bath,
Just for one
and I
hot
waited
sauce.
for it to get nice and cold. When it eventually got to around 5°C, I started adding concentrated sulfuric acid.
Dang.
Every time it was added, though, it generated a lot of heat, and I had to do it in small portions. I also had to keep the temperature below 10°C, and it took about an hour to add everything.
It's such a
When it
long
was finally
experiment.
done, I poured in some ice-cold water, and at this point, the Jones reagent was ready.
Now
I
it
didn't
looked
need
like
it right
vodka.
at this moment, though, so I just
It
let it
looked-
chill here for a bit. I then went and got another beaker, and into this, I added
Wait, not
350
vodka.
mils of acetone.
What's the brown one again? It's brandy or whiskey, one of those.
This was going to be the solvent for the reaction, and for now, the
It
only
just
other
looks
thing
like
that I
that
had
color.
to add was 5 grams of my fresh isononanol.
No.
I then turned on the stirring, and when it had all dissolved, I moved it to an
The
ice
little
bath,
whirlpool.
and I added a thermometer. I was also going to have to wait for this to cool down, and I left it here for about half an hour.
It was
When I
also
came
my
back
first
to it,
time.
the temperature
My first time holding a thermometer is also during my chemistry class. It just feels so fragile. And for some reason, high class.
was around
Expensive.
5°C, and what I had to do next was start adding the Jones reagent.
Adding the whiskey or brandy.
After it was added, it slowly changed color, and this was because the chromium in the Jones reagent was getting reduced. This was a very good sign that it was reacting with the isononanol,
Hey,
and hopefully,
it became
it
green.
was turning it into the isononanoic acid. The goal here was to eventually add all of the Jones reagent, but I had to do it really slowly. This was because every time that I added it, the temperature would increase, and to prevent side products, I had to keep it below 5°C. So I just kept adding it slowly
it
and
became
carefully,
blue.
and at some point it stopped changing colors and kind of just stayed a brownish orange. This was
Oh,
happening because the Jones reagent was starting to build up,
what are those? Oh, it's the condensed water. Okay.
and this told me that most of the isononanol had probably reacted. In total, it took about 3 hours to add everything, and now I had to just let it stir for a while. About 2 hours later,
How is
it
it
looked almost
stirring
the same,
itself?
and at this point, it should have been done. What I had to
Right.
do next was destroy all of that extra Jones reagent, and this was thankfully pretty simple. All I had to do was add some isopropyl rubbing alcohol. This would quickly react with it and turn into acetone, which was the same as the reaction solvent.
This is so
At
interesting.
first, I was adding it only a bit at a time because I didn't want to add too much.
It
I
became
eventually
cola.
kind of gave up though, and I just dumped in a whole bunch. This quickly caused the color to change to a really nice blue.
I like it.
I then let it stir like this for about 30 minutes to really make sure that all of the Jones reagent was destroyed.
How is it
When I
stirring
came back to
itself?
it looked pretty much the same, and the next thing I had to do was filter it. To do this, I poured it into a funnel with cotton and sea light, and I waited for it to
Oh,
slowly
it's a
pass
light
through.
blue.
This actually ended up going somewhat quickly, and I was eventually left with a nice and clear solution. Left in the funnel
I
was
like
a bunch
the
of
color.
dark blue chromium salts, and this was all waste. But anyway, what I had to do next was get rid of most of the acetone. So I put it on a hot plate, dropped in a stir bar, and cranked up the heating.
Oh, it's a stir
I also set up a fan
bar.
to blow on it to make
Hey.
it go faster, but it still took about 6 hours for most of it to disappear.
Nowadays, stirring all these things is so easy. Or maybe it's just that my chemistry class, it wants me to do it DIY. No help from other gadgets.
When I eventually felt like I'd gotten rid of enough, I poured it all into a separatory funnel. On top
It's
of
so
this, I added a bunch
pretty.
of distilled water to dilute it. Then I added a solvent called dichloromethane, or DCM for short.
How are you
It wasn't
reading?
able to mix with the water though, and it quickly sank to the bottom as a separate layer.
Yeah, like
With
how are
everything
you guys
added, I
remembering all these words and terms, all these names?
took it off the stand, and I started shaking it around. I was doing this to really mix things up, and when I felt that it was enough, I put it back on the stand.
It's so fragile.
As it
I'm
sat
so
there, the
scared
layer
of
separated again,
breaking it.
and all the DCM sank to the bottom. Now, assuming that I actually made any isononanoic acid, it should have been dissolved in the DCM. So, I drained it all out into a beaker.
This one needs to be automatic
Everything
too.
that was left in the funnel should have
Next
been
time.
mostly water and sulfuric acid. There still might have been some isononanoic acid though, so I added some more DCM to it, and I extracted it a few more times. After every extraction, I drained the dichloromethane into the same beaker, and I eventually had a bunch of cloudy liquid.
No,
It was
it's
all
all
cloudy because it
cloudy.
was full of water, and before moving on, I was gonna have to dry it. So, I poured it into another separatory funnel.
This
I then
funnel is
added
doing
some
so much
saturated
job.
salt water, which would pull out most of the water. I then shook it around, and when the layers eventually separated, it was looking pretty good.
Wow.
The only tricky part here was that the DCM was no longer the lower layer, and it was now the upper one. The bottom one was the salt water that I had added, and I drained it all away. I
Be
then poured
careful
everything
of
into a
that.
beaker, and unfortunately, it was still a bit cloudy.
Yeah.
So I turned on the stirring, and I added some anhydrous sodium sulfate
This is
to
so
dry it even
convenient.
more. I let this stir for a while, and when I felt that it was done,
Wow.
I poured it all into another flask.
It all become clear.
The next step was to get rid of all the DCM, and I had to do another distillation. This went relatively quickly, and after a while, all that was left was a thick oil. This was all hopefully isononanoic acid,
It's
but I
spinning.
don't think it was very pure, and I was gonna have to clean it up. So I stopped the distillation, and when everything had cooled down, I transferred all of it to a much smaller flask. I then attempted to distill it, but for some reason, it absolutely refused to work. Instead, it just bubbled and frothed, and after several hours of trying, it was still a complete failure. It was at this point that I really started worrying that I might have been stuck. I still had no idea how much of this was actually isononanoic acid, and it was going to be a big problem if I couldn't purify it.
Ah.
There was
He's worried, but I'm not worried anymore because look at all the processes he needs to go through. So I think that our hot sauce is authentic hot sauce and not plastic.
still hope, though,
Good.
because there was one other thing that I thought might work. So I got out a beaker and I added 50 mils of distilled water. Then into this, I shot in all of my goopy liquid. It all just quickly floated to the top, and I turned on the
Like
stirring.
oil. How do you turn it on? It's a remote control?
As an oil, it didn't at all mix with the water, but then I started adding a solution of sodium hydroxide drain cleaner. This was a very strong base, and if I did actually have isononanoic acid, it should react and turn into a water-soluble form. As I kept adding it, the oil slowly disappeared, and I was really happy to see this. This didn't fully confirm that this was isononanoic acid, but it was pretty good evidence.
Okay.
Even after adding a lot of base, though, it was still a bit cloudy, so I added a bunch more. However, this didn't really seem to do anything, and this was because there was some sort of impurity. I was going to have to get rid of it, and to do this,
Filter
I
it
was
out.
going to have to put it back
one
into
more
a separatory
time.
funnel. I then added a different solvent called hexanes, which would dissolve most of the impurities.
Hexanes.
After shaking it around, I drained out the lower layer, and I threw away the hexanes. I then put the lower layer back into the funnel, and I washed it a couple more times with hexanes.
Add more hexanes.
This would
Add
hopefully get rid
more.
of most of the side products, and any other junk that might be in there. When I was eventually done with that, it was time for the moment of truth. I had to add some dilute acid, and this would immediately tell me if everything had worked. I was pretty sure that it had, but I was also completely prepared to be disappointed. So I just dumped it all in, and it almost immediately turned everything white, which I was extremely happy to see.
Yippee!
This was all isononanoic acid being regenerated, and it was going back to being insoluble in water. I then again added some hexanes, but this
Add
time
more.
it would actually
More
dissolve the
hexanes.
isononanoic acid.
More
I then shook
hexanes.
it around, and I waited for the layers to separate. However, now, it was the hexanes part that I wanted. So I drained away the lower one, and I dumped all the hexanes into a beaker.
More hexanes.
I then did the same extraction a few more times, and I combined everything. When I was done, I added some sodium sulfate to dry it, and I stirred it for several minutes. Now, all I had to do was get rid of the hexanes. So I
no.
poured it all into a flask, and I did what felt like the billionth distillation. This thankfully didn't take very long, though, and about an hour later, it looked like all the hexanes were gone.
No, he
I
didn't
then
want
let
the
it cool
hexanes
down,
anymore.
and I transferred it all to a small vial.
Bwit. Bwit.
My final yield here was 3.5 grams of nearly pure isononanoic acid,
That's so little.
and this was pretty much the perfect amount.
Okay.
Okay, so now, after a week or so of pain,
Oh,
I had
man.
the first major piece of my spicy molecule. This was only half of it, though, and getting this was also kind of the easy part.
What?
The hard part was going to be actually building it into the spicy molecule that I wanted, called nor-dihydrocapsaicin. This was mostly because I
All the
started this
names.
project without even knowing how I was going to do it. I mean,
You did not
I
plan.
had a few basic ideas, but nothing really concrete. By the time that I got to this point, though, I realized that there was only one decent way. I was gonna have to build the entire other half separately and then add it onto the isononanoic acid.
Sheesh.
Normally, this wouldn't be too bad, but in this case, not only was I unsure how to make it, I was kind of unsure how to add it. The only thing that I knew was that the chemical that I needed looked oddly similar to something called vanillin, which is the
Vanillin?
major flavor component of vanilla. So now,
Not again.
I had to update
Don't tell me like our vanillas are plastic too.
the plan for the project. I was gonna have to get my hands on some vanillin and turn it into something called vanillylamine. I could then add this to my isononanoic acid to make the beautiful and spicy nor-dihydrocapsaicin. So I guess now I would be technically turning plastic gloves and vanilla into hot sauce,
Plastic gloves
which I
plus
honestly think is
vanilla.
even weirder. I mean, it all makes sense on paper, but I still find it really hard to believe that these two completely unrelated things can be combined to make spiciness.
Yeah, like vanilla is the least spicy thing you'll ever think of. Who knew that it can be made into spicy sauce?
But anyway,
The spicy
to get
thing
started,
is the plastic.
the first thing that I had to do was get some vanillin. From past experience, I found that the best and easiest source was vanilla sugar, and I found a
vanilla
bunch
is not
of it
the
at a grocery
plastic.
store. I wasn't
Vanilla is
exactly
still
sure how
safe.
many to get, but I figured that 18 was a
whole
decent
thing?
amount.
Whoa!
I then started cutting them all open.
The cashier gonna be like, sir, a lot of vanilla, I see. Making a cake? No, I'm trying to make hot sauce and with plastic and also vanilla. You wanna try? I let you be the first one to try it after I'm done. I don't worry about the funeral cost lah. I help pay also.
And dumping them into a beaker. In total, this was going to give me a bit over 300 grams of vanilla sugar, and it only took a few minutes to empty everything.
That's a lot. All those vanilla waste.
When all of them were eventually added, I started pouring in some methanol, and I added just enough to cover it. In total, this ended up being about 300 mils, and then I started mixing it. What I was trying to do here was selectively dissolve the vanillin, which was kind of just mixed into a bunch of sugar. The sugar itself was practically insoluble in methanol, and pretty much all of it should be left behind. But anyway, I then let it sit there for about 30 minutes to really make sure that I dissolved as much vanillin as possible. When I came back, it looked pretty much the same, and what I had to do next was separate the methanol.
You want above
to do this,
one
I was
or
going to have to filter
below
it,
one?
and I scooped it all into my vacuum filter. When it was all eventually added, I washed the beaker with some extra methanol, and I mixed it around a bit. I then turned on my vacuum pump, and I pulled all the methanol into a flask below the filter. To really make sure that I got out all the vanillin, I washed the sugar a couple more times with methanol, and that was basically it.
This is all sugar! Like 80% or maybe 90% of that vanilla powder thing is sugar.
Was that some of the sugar had made it through, and it made things a bit cloudy. This was relatively easy to fix though, and I just filtered it again through some cotton and sea light. It was kind of slow, but what came through was a lot better, and it was almost crystal clear.
Oh crap.
What I had now was a
all these water sounds make me wanna pee. Huh, I'm back. What? Why are you looking at me like that? Can the fox go pee?
Relatively clean looking solution, and what I had to do next was get rid of all the methanol. In theory, assuming it's actually in there,
let's go.
This should leave me with relatively pure vanillin. So I turned on the stirring and the heating, and I waited for it to warm up. Over the next 2 hours, the methanol slowly disappeared, and when there was only about 200 mils left, I transferred it to a smaller beaker.
It's still spinning!
I then just waited again, and when it eventually got down to about 25 mils, I transferred it to an even smaller beaker. At
It
this
became
point,
whiskey
there really
again.
wasn't very much methanol left, and when it eventually got to around 10 mils, it looked like it stopped decreasing. So I pulled it off the hot plate, and I waited for it to cool down.
The
As it
hot
was
plate is so
cooling, I was really
useful.
hoping that it would solidify, but it apparently stayed as a liquid, and it looked like it separated into layers. This was a bit
Wow.
odd, but to fix it, I decided to try stirring it around and scraping the sides of the beaker. This can sometimes get things to crystallize, and at first, it really didn't look like it was working. However, I started seeing some little white bits, and then a whole bunch of solid stuff started appearing. This was all
Stir.
vanillin, and it looked like there was a decent amount.
All this vanilla. All of this.
I kept stirring it for
Vanilla.
a couple minutes, but it still didn't look like everything had precipitated.
It became
There was
creamy.
probably still some methanol there, keeping it dissolved, so I added some water to force it out.
Oh, I hate the scrapping
This
sound.
actually seemed to work pretty well,
The squeaky
so just for
sound.
good measure, I added a few more mils, and that was about it. What I had now was a bunch of wet vanillin, but I wanted a nice powder, so I transferred it all to a vacuum filter.
It's gonna smell nice. It's all vanilla. Vanilla ice cream.
When everything was in there, I turned on my vacuum pump, and I pulled away the water. I then mixed it around a bit, and I was starting to see the powder that I wanted. It was still contaminated with methanol and sugar, though, so I added some
Still
cold water
more?
to wash it.
More sugar.
After mixing it around and pulling away the water, it was already looking a lot better. Just for good measure, I washed it a few more times, and when I was done, I dumped it all into a small dish.
Oh, it became.
I was
it
really
became
happy
white
with
powder.
what I had so far, but it was still kind of wet, and I was gonna have to dry it. So, I put it into a small desiccator.
Ding, ding.
I left it there for a couple days, and when I
Days.
eventually opened it up, I was hit with the really nice smell of vanilla.
Yeah. Wow, it's so dry.
What I had now was nearly pure vanillin, and I had about 3.6 grams of it. The only issue was that this was going to be just barely enough for what I had to do, and unlike with the isononanol, I didn't have much room to screw up. But anyway,
But that's
now
a
that I had
lot.
the vanillin, I could try turning it into the vanillamine, and the first step was to make something called vanillin oxime. To do this, I got a beaker, and I added 1.81 grams of something called hydroxylamine hydrochloride and 6.44 grams of sodium acetate trihydrate. On top of this, I poured in 25 mils of water, and I stirred it until it all dissolved.
Spin! Spin!
Then into the solution, I dumped in all of the vanillin.
Oh,
As it sat there, the
all of
vanillin
it.
slowly mixed into the water, but I don't think much of it actually dissolved. This is because vanillin is almost insoluble in room temperature water, and I was going to have to heat it up. So I covered the beaker with a small watch glass, and I turned on the hot plate. Over the next 10 minutes, it slowly got hotter and hotter, but it didn't look like too much was happening. That apparently changed, though, when it eventually got hot enough, and all of the vanillin quickly disappeared. I then continued heating it until it started boiling. At this point, the vanillin should have been reacting with the hydroxylamine hydrochloride and turning into vanillin oxime. This was also supposed to be a relatively fast reaction, and I just had to leave it for a bit. When I came back to it about 15 minutes later, it looked pretty much the same. I then took it off the hot plate, and what I had to do next was wait for it to cool down. For over an hour, though, pretty much nothing happened, and it only became slightly cloudy.
No, it's more
However,
cloudy.
it then turned white, and some really nice crystals started slowly growing. This was all supposed to be vanillin oxime, and it was separating out because it wasn't very soluble in water. When it eventually cooled to room temperature, I put it in the fridge overnight so that it could fully crystallize.
So you just need the
next
crystallized
day,
thing?
I did pretty much the exact same thing that I did with the vanillin. I poured all of it into my vacuum filter, and I pulled away the water. I then washed it a
Ta-da!
few times with cold water, and when I was done, I had some nice crystals, but they were still kind of wet. So I
Put it
transferred them
again.
to a dish, and I put them in the same desiccator as before.
Yeah, the
This time, though, when I
desiccator.
took it out, there was absolutely no smell.
Why?
To make sure that this was actually vanillin oxime, I tested it to see what temperature it melted at. It ended up being almost exactly the same as pure vanillin oxime, and I was
Wow.
pretty happy to see that. This told me that what I had was quite pure,
So
but I was only able
impressive.
to make 3.2 grams of it, which again, was gonna be just enough.
Like being a chemist is quite fun, just the process is so grueling. You need to grind a lot.
But with that being said, up until now, this vanillin part had honestly been pretty easy. What I had to do next, though, was the part that I was afraid of. I had to turn the vanillin oxime into the final molecule that I needed, called vanillylamine, and I had no idea how to do it.
It needs
What
to
was even
change
worse
once more.
was that I tried to do this conversion several times over the years, and it always failed. I had even tried many completely different ways, and it just never seemed to work.
Oh,
However,
why?
there was
Why would
still
you do
one
that?
very promising method that I hadn't attempted yet. The only issue was that I couldn't find a decent procedure for it, and it also used mercury, which wasn't ideal.
Mercury.
Based on what I read, though,
I don't think you
I
can
had a
eat
lot of faith that I could
mercury.
make it work, and I decided to just go for it. I used all of the vanillin oxime that I just made, and the reaction seemed to be working.
With the
However, after a
mercury?
couple days, and after way too much testing, I finally accepted that it had failed. I have no idea where I went wrong or why it didn't work, and I honestly don't know what I expected. Either way, I had just lost everything that I'd spent a week making, but that's just kind of how it is sometimes.
Hey, what's that?
My much bigger concern was that I had no idea what to try next. Thankfully, though, after a bunch of searching, I stumbled onto something that I liked. In the past, I'd never tried to do something called the hydrogenation because all of the methods that I saw always used high-pressure hydrogen, which kind of scared me. This one, though, claimed that it could be done without high pressure, and it just took a lot longer. So, I decided to try it out, but first,
Will it explode
I
or
had to
something?
buy a bunch more vanilla sugar. I then quickly extracted
The shop owner or the cashier be like, huh, this guy is seriously liking our vanilla. Oh, you want some vanilla? Too bad. It got sold out by a random person. He just bought the whole thing, the whole box.
the vanillin, and I made more vanillin oxime. For this new method, it probably would have been a good idea to be a bit safer and to try it with just a portion of the oxime.
Yeah.
However, if this didn't work, I had no other ideas anyway, so I just decided to use everything again.
Okay.
To get started, I got out one of my nice flasks,
This is
and
the
I
last
connected my
straw.
argon line to the neck on the left. I then dropped in a funnel, and I started shooting argon into the flask. This would push out all the air and replace it with the argon, which is an inert gas.
Wait, this
After
reminds me
several
of an
seconds, I turned
anime,
off the argon,
Dr. Stone.
and I carefully added a small amount of a catalyst called palladium
All the
on carbon.
science thing.
On top of this, I dropped in a stir bar, and then I went and got a beaker. Into this, I added 80 mils of pure ethanol, and this was going to be the solvent for the reaction. I then turned on the stirring, and I dumped in all of the vanillin oxime.
Blup.
It wasn't super soluble in the ethanol, but after stirring it for a couple minutes, it all eventually disappeared.
Wow.
I then turned the argon back on, and I poured in all of this oxime ethanol solution. It was very important to do this under argon, because if there was any air around, the catalyst can sometimes ignite the ethanol.
Oh no.
I was very happy
It's gonna
when
burn.
I didn't see any fire, and I used a bit more ethanol to wash everything. I then turned on the stirring, and I added the last major ingredient, which was concentrated hydrochloric acid.
I wonder,
Now,
will
with the flask
anything
fully
explode?
loaded, I took away the funnel, and I replaced it with a stopper. To the middle one, I added a 3-way adapter, And I also swapped the argon one for a stopper.
Like, even if it exploded, I don't think it will, like, explode the whole research lab, right? It's gonna be a little small explosion in front of you, right? Not the whole lab is gonna explode into nothingness, right?
Then, to this new three-way adapter, I attached a vacuum line, and I added a balloon that I had filled with argon. Before doing anything, I had to be absolutely sure that there was no air or oxygen. So I switched on my vacuum pump, and I turned the valve. I then quickly turned the valve back, and I repressurized it with argon. What I just did here counted as one cycle, and I was gonna have to do it 3 more times. When I was done, it was time to start the fun part, and I swapped out the inert argon balloon for a scary hydrogen one.
Oh, Jesus.
In general, hydrogen balloons are actually pretty safe, but it is possible for them to explode in a giant fireball.
Oh,
But anyway, I then did the exact same thing that I just did with the argon. The only difference this time was that the hydrogen made my pump sound a lot higher pitched, which I thought was interesting.
Oh, it is a little bit higher pitched.
But anyway, after doing this 3 times, the flask should be completely filled with hydrogen gas, and now I basically just had to wait. What was happening here was hopefully a hydrogenation, where the oxime was being reduced by the hydrogen and turned into vanillylamine.
Did he
Any
put more
vanillylamine would then quickly react with the hydrochloric acid and turn into vanillylamine hydrochloride. Also, as I mentioned before, all of the black palladium on carbon was just a catalyst, and it was allowing the hydrogen to react with the oxime. As the hydrogen was consumed, the balloon would shrink, and it was an easy way to track the progress. With hydrogen, though, there are almost always leaks, so it's not super accurate. But either way, this was going to take a while, and all I had to do was occasionally swap the balloon for a full one. When I came back to it about 24 hours later, I think the only difference was that it looked a lot messier.
Yeah, it looked dirty.
It was supposed to be done. What I had to do next was filter everything that was in this flask, but I couldn't just start taking everything apart. It was still full of hydrogen gas, and if I just opened it up, the whole thing could light on fire.
Oh.
I was first going to have to get rid of that hydrogen balloon and bring back the argon one. Then with that in place, I did the same vacuum cycles that I did before, and I replaced everything with argon. At this point, it should have been safe, and I carefully opened it up. I was very happy when nothing lit on fire.
We are safe.
But the danger wasn't quite over yet. What I had to do next was filter it, and there was still a chance that it could spontaneously light on fire. So just in case, I set up an argon line above my filter funnel to protect everything from air. I then carefully poured everything in, and again, there was thankfully no fire. Everything that made it through the filter was also surprisingly clear and colorless, which I was really happy to see. It took about 20 minutes for it all to make it into the beaker, and then I washed the reaction flask in the funnel with some extra ethanol.
More ethanol.
I then waited for all of that to pass through, and by the time that it was done, it looked like it had become a bit yellow, and I'm not exactly sure why. Either way, what I had to do next was get rid of all of the ethanol and any leftover hydrochloric acid. So I poured it all into a round bottom flask, and I was gonna have to do a distillation. For this one though, I decided to make it a bit more interesting, and I used one of my fancier condensers. But anyway, this ended up taking a few hours, and when it was close to being done, it was looking pretty good. However, it then suddenly got cloudy.
This is such a random thought, but what if the fancy ones got dirty inside? How do you even wash it?
Cloudy, and not too long after,
a really
it had
random
apparently
thought.
turned pink. I thought this was the most that it would change, but then it got even darker, and by the time it was done, it was a dirty brown.
Hey.
I'm not exactly sure why this happened, and I was also a bit worried that it would be a pain to get out of the flask.
But it's
so
still
I stopped
spinning.
the distillation, and I waited for it to cool down, and I really thought this was going to be a disaster. However,
But
when I tried shooting in some ethanol, it worked
oh,
surprisingly well.
okay.
Everything was almost immediately removed from the sides of the flask, and some of it even looked like it was turning white. I then transferred it
That
all to a small
ethanol so
beaker,
useful.
and I used a bit more ethanol to wash out.
Although those ethanol is used on cleaning surfaces and stuff, but seriously, it's flammable. It's so dangerous. Who knows you're smoking or something, and that one little fire, kaboosh, and your hair become Afro style.
The flask. What I had to do now was turn on the hot plate and bring it to a boil. I was doing this to try to clean up all the solid stuff, which I was hoping was vanillylamine hydrochloride. After boiling it for a few minutes, I took it off, and almost immediately, I saw some white powder separating out. I was again hoping that this was the right thing, and when it eventually got to around room temperature, I put it in the freezer overnight. When I checked on it the next day,
Freezer.
it looked like a bit more of it had appeared. But either way, what I had to do next was isolate it, and I
It's a
poured it
small
all into my
beaker.
vacuum filter.
I just noticed it's so small. A very cute one.
I then turned on my pump and I pulled away all the liquid, and I washed it a few times with cold ethanol. When it was eventually done, I dried it in the desiccator, and this was what I was left with.
More
It was a
vanilla?
bunch of nice and white powder, and I was really hoping it was the right thing. The only way to confirm this, though, was to run some tests on it, and I started by checking its melting point. However, unlike last time, I was very disappointed. It was
No,
supposed to
it
start
did not.
melting at 219°C, but it instead started melting at around 208, and then it looked like it burned. Another test was to see if it
Well,
were soluble in water, and pretty much all of it disappeared, which was good. However, when I added some base to it, which was supposed to bring it back, it never seemed to work.
you can
This
make.
was
You
exactly
can
what had
bring it
happened
back.
many times in the past when I had tried making it before. The properties of whatever I made just didn't seem to match up with vanillylamine hydrochloride. I was honestly pretty sad at this point, but as one final and desperate test, I decided to run something called an NMR.
What is
Just by
this?
chance,
Why
a week earlier,
nuclear?
I'd gotten my hands on a little NMR machine, and I figured I might as well try it out.
Yes,
I
a whole
honestly assumed that it was just going to be a
laboratory.
waste of time, but surprisingly, that actually wasn't the case. The result that I got matched up perfectly with what I was hoping for, and when I saw this, I really didn't know what to believe.
Oh,
According to the NMR, this was vanillylamine hydrochloride.
okay.
According to everywhere else, though, that reported the melting point and its other properties, it was something else. In general, though,
It was
NMR is
something
way
else.
more trustworthy, and I decided to just ignore all the other stuff.
Okay, don't
Did I
cope.
actually make the vanillylamine hydrochloride? I
Maybe.
wasn't entirely sure, but I figured that the best way to find out was to just move on to the next reaction. For this one, I would be finally combining it with the isononanoic acid to make the nor-dihydrocapsaicin. What was also nice was that if this worked, I wouldn't have to
Nor-dihydro.
only rely on fancy tests to verify it, and in theory, I could just taste it and see if it burned my mouth off. The only problem with this step, like I mentioned earlier, was that I really wasn't sure how to do it. Thankfully, though,
But you
the
don't really
paper that
wanna like taste your random experiment stuff, no?
I'd used
Will
for
it
the
be poisonous?
hydrogenation
It is plastic, you know?
might have had the answer. They used a method that I'd never heard of before, and I think it's mostly used in biochemistry. However, their hydrogenation seemed to work, so I trusted them, and I decided to give it a try. I had learned from my past, though, and I decided to not just do it with everything that I had. This was because I had a lot more than I expected to have at this point, and it seemed like I could get away with using half. This way, if I
Half of
completely
it.
screwed up, I'd at least have one more try. But anyway, to get started, I got a little flask and I added 15 mils of a solvent called DMF. Then into this, I added 0.76 grams of my isononanoic acid. After that, I turned on the stirring and I added something called Dipia. This was a base, and it was supposed to react with the isononanoic acid. It should have been turning it into its deprotonated form, and this was important for the next step. To make sure that it all reacted, I let it stir for several minutes, and then I added another chemical called HAT2.
Spin!
This one should have been reacting with the deprotonated isononanoic acid and
Hatus,
forming this
that's
new
a lot.
molecule. This reaction was a little bit slow though, and I had to leave it for about 30 minutes. During this time, it slowly got darker and darker, and I wasn't exactly sure if that was a good thing. But either way, when I came back to it, it was time to add the last ingredient.
It looks
This was
like
the
coffee.
vanillamine hydrochloride, and I was still really hoping that I'd actually made it.
The things
The
that I
moment that it was
imagine are
added,
all food.
It should have been reacting with some of the dipia
Technically,
and
this
turning
is
into
food too.
free-base vanillamine. This should then be able to attack that isononanoic acid molecule that I made before. If this were actually happening, the vanillamine would be combining with the isononanoic acid. It would then kick off that extra junk from the earlier step, and the final result would be my precious spicy molecule called nordihydrocapsaicin. This reaction was supposed to be relatively slow though,
It's such a
and
long
I was gonna
process.
have to leave it here for a while. So just for good measure, and to protect it from oxygen, I filled the flask with some argon.
Again.
I then covered the
Slurp.
top, and I left it there overnight. When I came back to
Like there's of course a lot of consumer materials made by chemical, but I don't need to know that.
it about 20 hours later, it looked like it had gotten a bit lighter. I wasn't sure if this was a good sign, but it at least looked like something had happened. Either way, it was now time to try and separate out the nordihydrocapsaicin and to see if the reaction had actually worked. So I started the fun process by preloading a separatory funnel with some hexanes
Hello,
and dumping everything in.
hexanus. Who?
These two things
Ooh,
didn't really mix
hexanus.
together, and then I added a bunch of saturated salt water. I then did the extraction in the usual way, where I took it off the stand and shook it around. The idea here was to pull all of the nordihydrocapsaicin into the hexanes, and then to wait for the layers to separate.
Hexane.
This was about 10 minutes later, and most of it should have been extracted into the upper hexanes layer,
Hexanus.
so I drained away the lower one.
It sounds like some god's name.
Left in the funnel was just the hexanes, but there was also a bunch of other junk that made it look really
Like in those
dirty.
fantasy
The hexanes
stories.
itself, though, was relatively clean, and I dumped it all into a beaker. I then put that lower layer back into the separatory funnel, and I extracted it 4 more times. I did this just to really make sure that I got everything out, and I transferred them all to the same beaker.
Is there a little bit brown?
What I had now looked pretty clean, but the extraction probably pulled out some other junk as well. I was going to have to get this out, and to do this, I had to put it all back into a separatory funnel. I then added some
Yes, a
dilute
lot of
hydrochloric
funnels.
acid, which would pull out any basic impurities. After shaking it around, I drained it away, and I repeated the same washing. I then did another washing with dilute base, and another with saturated salt water. When I was eventually
How
done,
many funnels does
I
he
felt that
have?
it was looking pretty good. So I poured it all back into a beaker, and I added some anhydrous sodium sulfate to dry it.
Look. Spin! Spin!
When it looked like it was done, I poured it into another beaker, and now in theory, I just had to get rid of the hexanes. This would hopefully leave me with
Oh,
just
not
nordihydrocapsaicin, and I was honestly pretty nervous.
I'm calling it hexanus from now
Over
on.
the next few hours, the hexanes slowly disappeared, and I ended up transferring it to a smaller beaker. I then kept going, and in my opinion, it was looking really promising. However,
It's moving.
it was a total failure. All
Why?
I ended up with
It just looks
was
like
a
alcohol.
very small amount of oily junk
Yeah,
and it was
like
at this
oil
moment
stuff.
that I was really happy I only used half of my vanillamine.
Oh well.
Like every other time, I initially didn't know what had gone wrong, and my biggest fear was that I hadn't actually made the vanillamine. However, It turned out that it was just entirely my fault.
What?
The procedure clearly said that a solvent called ethyl acetate was used, but this was just a general procedure, and I decided to swap it to hexanes. I
Oh,
did this
no, it's
because the hexanes had
Hexana's
worked
fault.
really well with the isononanoic acid, and I figured that it would work well again. However, I was completely wrong, and I was punished for my assumption. So now
At least
it
you
was
used
time to
half
try
of
it
it
again,
only.
except using ethyl acetate, and I only had one chance to make it work. I set the reaction up in the exact same way as before, and when it was done, 20 hours later, I added it to a separatory funnel.
This guy is
I
seriously a
also
trial
washed it
and
with a bit of
error.
water to make sure that I transferred everything. I then added a bunch of saturated salt solution, and this easily dissolved everything. After that, I added some ethyl acetate,
Ooh.
and I could immediately tell that it was better than the hexanes. It looked like it had actually dissolved stuff, and it had completely pulled out the color. I then did the usual
Ah.
shaking part, and this time, it was way cleaner. I didn't have any of that
Pretty.
weird goopy stuff floating around, and it was a lot easier to drain away the lower layer.
Up, 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 up.
But anyway, like before, I transferred the ethyl acetate to a beaker, and I repeated the extraction 4 times.
It's cleaner.
After that, I poured it all back into a separatory funnel, and I washed it a bunch of times with dilute hydrochloric acid, dilute sodium bicarbonate, and saturated salt solution.
There's no
When it was
way
done,
our
it looked pretty much
hot
the
sauce
same,
is
and I put
is
it all
fake
back into
now.
a beaker. I then dumped in some anhydrous sodium sulfate, and I turned on the stirring. Unlike
I know, like-
hexanes, ethyl acetate really likes to pick up water, so this step was even more important than before.
You know, like there's fake rice, like plastic rice or something, but I don't think hot sauce is gonna be fake because look at the freaking process he had.
When I felt that it was ready, the next step was to filter it, and I was already much happier with how this was going. It all ended up making it through relatively quickly, and what I had to do now was get rid of the ethyl acetate. So I turned on the hot plate, and I was just hoping to be left with something this time.
This whole process
As
is
it
just
evaporated,
adding, taking
the
out,
color
adding,
slowly
and
got
taking
darker
out.
and darker, and this was a good sign that there was something there. After a couple hours, there was almost nothing left, and I transferred it to a vial. I then continued evaporating it by blowing air on it, until eventually,
Okay.
it actually stopped decreasing. I was very relieved when I saw this because it meant that I actually had something, but I now kind of had the opposite problem.
No more
I actually
water.
had too much stuff, and it was more than I could have even theoretically made. If this were actually nor-dihydrocapsaicin, it definitely wasn't pure. So I had to come up with a way to purify it, and what I came up with didn't seem too bad. It was very
More.
similar to what I had done for the isononanoic acid. All I needed was a 5% solution of potassium hydroxide, and then into this, I shot in all of the dark oil.
All of it. Bleh, bleh.
Like last time, I was a bit worried that it wouldn't disappear. However, I was very relieved when I turned on the stirring,
Spin.
and most of it quickly dissolved. It was all turning into a water-soluble form, but after a few minutes, there was still some stubborn stuff left over. So I kept adding some more 5% potassium hydroxide, and I was eventually left with a nice and clear solution.
It's
There
seriously
was still
adding
a
and
bit of
taking
junk
out,
floating around,
adding.
but that was okay, and what I had to do next was pour it into one final separatory funnel. I
Yes,
also
a lot
washed the
of
beaker with a
funnels.
bit of water, just to make sure that I transferred everything.
Lep.
I then added hexanes to dissolve all the junk
More
that wasn't water
hexanas.
soluble.
Hexanas.
This time, though, it wasn't a mistake using hexanes, and I was specifically using it because I knew that it wouldn't touch the nor-dihydrocapsaicin. I ended up washing it twice with the hexanes, and I got rid of those washings. Then after that, I drained all of my precious orange water into a beaker.
It's brown.
The next step was to try and get back the nor-dihydrocapsaicin, and to do this, I decided to use CO2 gas. I used a pipette to shoot in a gentle stream of it,
CO2.
and this should have been slowly acidifying the solution. Almost immediately, I started seeing some white stuff appearing, and I was very relieved to see this.
Okay.
At this point,
What's
I
that?
was 95% sure that I had actually made the Nordihydrocapsaicin, and it was also looking like it was nice and pure.
What's
Over
the
the
white
next
stuff?
30 minutes,
Oh,
more
wow.
of it
It's
slowly
pretty.
appeared, but it also started changing color.
Now it reminds me of latte. Oh god. I'm freaking
I was
hungry.
really hoping that it would become a white powder, but it was instead looking like a brown goo.
Hey, it's not pretty anymore.
A few minutes later, the solution had become completely clear, and I pulled out the pipette. It was stuck to all
Hey.
that goo, though, and I had to smear it on the beaker to get it off.
Hey.
I then dumped off all of the water, and I added some ethyl acetate. I used the CO2 pipette to shoot around the ethyl acetate, and I kept going until everything had dissolved.
Oh wow.
Just for good measure, I added a bunch of extra ethyl acetate, and then, like I did a bunch of times before,
Take it out
I
again.
added some sodium sulfate to dry it.
Spin!
This time, though,
No.
I didn't just filter it through cotton and sea light, and I also used some silica gel. I found that this was very important to take out polar impurities like salts, and it seemed to really help clean it up. It also seemed to take out some of the color, and I ran it through the same filter a few times. When I was eventually done, it was definitely
Oh.
a much lighter color.
It's so
I
pretty.
also had twice the amount of solvent, though, because I had to wash the funnel a few times with some extra ethyl acetate. Either way, this wasn't an issue, because the next step was to get rid of the solvent. This would hopefully leave me with nearly pure Nordihydrocapsaicin, and I turned on the hot plate. After a while, there was barely anything in the beaker, and like before, I transferred it all to a vial.
Blep. Blep. Blep.
I then continued evaporating it by blowing on it, and again, it eventually stopped decreasing. This time, though, it was actually an amount that was possible to make. It was also definitely way cleaner,
Can we
but
make
it looked
hot
like there was
sauce
still
now?
some solvent in it. So to get rid of it, I stored it under a vacuum, and this was what I had a few days later. It was a much thicker oil, and I couldn't help but think that it kind of looked spicy. It was also barely
No.
anything, only around a gram, and it was honestly hard to believe that I spent months trying to make this. At this point, though,
This little
I
thing.
still wasn't completely
Months.
sure that this was actually Nordihydrocapsaicin. To find out, I was honestly tempted to just taste it, but
No,
I didn't really want to potentially poison myself.
Yeah.
It was much smarter to first run it through my new and fancy NMR machine.
Yes.
So, I carefully loaded a sample into it, and I nervously waited for the result. When it eventually popped up on the screen, I was extremely relieved by what I saw. It was almost exactly what I was hoping for, and it basically confirmed that I did have Nordihydrocapsaicin.
So you can
However,
eat it now?
I still felt that to be 100% sure, I just had to taste it.
Oh no.
All I needed, though, was an extremely small amount, because if this were Nordihydrocapsaicin, it would be really potent.
Yeah, do not eat it. This video is out, so he's still alive.
So I guess I just have to try it.
Oh no. The moment of truth. Yum.
Okay. Okay.
I can't.
It's definitely spicy.
What does it
Took
taste
a couple
like?
seconds to sense anything.
Is there
Yeah,
a
okay.
smell? Oh, the spice is kicking in.
I was expecting to be much happier when I realized it was spicy. It's
What?
kind of just painful.
Oh. So it's poison? Oh.
Oh,
Hiccup.
is that from the spice? Oh God. Oh no.
Oh no.
I've never had spicy hiccups before.
Same.
Oh, it doesn't feel good. Yeah, it's definitely. I can confirm that's spicy.
But does it taste anything other than
So
Is there any
I guess
taste
it worked.
other than spicy? Other
I did
flavors?
it. It worked.
Yay! But it gave you hiccups.
But anyway, with that all confirmed, I could finally try making my hot sauce, which was now almost 2 years in the making. To get started with this, the first thing that I needed were some
2
ingredients,
years.
and
Dang.
most hot sauces are made from chili peppers.
Yeah.
However, chili peppers are of course spicy, and it would kind of defeat the purpose if I used them. I was instead going to have to make it from something that was completely unspicy, and I decided to just go with roasted red peppers. For the recipe,
Red pepper
I
is
wanted
still
it to be
spicy.
as simple as possible, and I started by adding 2
That's
of the
one
peppers.
big one. A blip.
Then on top of this, I threw in some onions, a small piece of garlic.
Finally,
And some
we're
salt.
on to the cooking part.
I kind of just made up this recipe, and I'm normally pretty horrible at cooking, but I felt like this was so simple that it couldn't possibly be bad. But anyway, what I had to do next was blend it for a couple minutes.
Wow, 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 wow.
When I eventually felt that it looked nice and liquidy, I turned it off. I then opened it up, and I was pretty happy with what I had.
With
It
the
actually
smell?
looked like a hot sauce, and it smelled pretty good as well.
Ooh.
Right now, though, it was still completely unspicy, and what I had to do next was add the Nordihydrocapsaicin. Adding
You
it as
add
a
a
thick
little?
oil, though, would have been really hard, and I first had to dissolve it in some ethanol. So, I added a bunch of 94% ethanol,
So
and I
useful.
mixed it around until it all dissolved.
But flammable. Can you even eat it? What, huh?
When I was eventually done, it was way goopier than I thought it would be, and I also had no idea how much to use. Based on almost nothing, though, I felt that half
It
of
is
it would
used
be a
for
good amount,
disinfectant.
and I just went ahead and shot it all in.
You don't eat it, but you used to disinfect wounds. I don't know.
I then started mixing it
Not
around,
a doctor.
and now I was basically done. Finally,
Okay.
after probably way too much effort, I had actually made some synthetic hot sauce. The only problem was that I had no idea how spicy it was, and after my last experience, I was honestly a bit scared. I was also a bit worried that it wouldn't
I thought he's gonna make the whole hot sauce using synthetic stuff, but there's red pepper for the
even
taste.
taste good,
Ah,
but I guess there was only one way to find out.
just to make the spicy
Okay,
stuff.
so yeah, it's finally time to taste it. And
But it's
I
interesting
decided to
to
put a bunch
watch.
of it on a chicken wing.
A chicken
So,
wing.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
He just wants to eat the chicken wing. That's a lot of. You just hiccuped from. You just hiccuped from that just now.
Oh no.
Oh no. Yum 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 yum.
Oh god.
More hiccups.
It's not as bad. Okay.
Okay.
Honestly, it's pretty good.
It must be the red pepper.
It's like right on that threshold of being completely inedible.
Inedible.
I think I have to finish this wing, right?
So
Do I
it
put more
tastes
sauce on?
bad.
You know what? I need to put more on. I think my whole face is burning.
It's too hot.
Why am I doing this?
Even though it's an authentic hot sauce, you don't put a lot of it. Unless you really like the spice.
Oh god. Yeah.
His
Oh,
voice
it's
is
definitely
gonna...
like a chicken wing hot sauce challenge. But honestly, in terms of flavor, I rate it like 7.5, which is pretty good.
And a
In terms of
half.
spiciness, a 7. It could be worse. Okay, so it had apparently all worked out,
It's all the lucky
and I was
7.
actually able to turn plastic gloves into hot sauce. Or I mean, technically plastic gloves and vanilla, which I honestly think is even better. Also, this was something that I'd been wanting to do since
It
I
doesn't
started this
have the
channel,
vanilla taste
and I'm
anyway.
really glad that I was finally able to do it. For now, though, I think I need a break from doing so much organic chem. Instead, I think I'm gonna work on more cutting-edge projects, like turning wood into a bouncy ball. But anyway, this project ended up taking way longer than I thought, and I think it took about 4 months to put it all together. So, I really want to give a big thanks to all my patrons for making long projects like this possible, and to Micro Center for sponsoring this video. If you haven't already heard about Micro Center, they're a great resource for tech, DIY, and just computer stuff in general. They have a huge array of parts and peripherals, and they sell almost anything you'd ever need. Whether you're looking to get into 3D printing, upgrade your computer, fly a drone, or to just do your own custom electronic stuff.
I love 3D printing.
They also have physical locations.
It's so interesting.
So you can actually go in-store and see exactly what you're buying. They also offer a really useful tool on their website if you're looking to build your own PC from scratch.
Oh, wow.
One of the most annoying things is trying to figure out what is compatible, and this makes it really easy to put something together that you know will actually work. On top of this, they also offer a service where they can assemble the whole thing for you. But anyway, with that being said, I definitely recommend checking out Micro Center. Right now, they're also offering new customers a free 128 gig flash drive and a micro SD card. To get it, you just have to follow the link in the description to get a coupon code,
which you can then trade in
store for the drive and the SD card. With that being said, though, this video is finally done.
Wait, isn't Luciano Vargas a character from Hetalia? A 2P Hetalia? It could be someone's name, but that's a very cool name.